As many of you would know, Ashish is a thinker and a writer. He's published more than 25 books. He has, or is widely acknowledged to be the most prominent, most outspoken public intellectual, not only in India, but in South Asia. He was listed among the world's top 100 public intellectuals by a British magazine, Prospect, and Foreign Affairs, the journal in the United States. So much that Ashish has written, so much that is said, is not relevant only to India, or indeed to the whole of Asia, but to Australia. I can think of no one, and certainly no public intellectual in Australia, who can reveal the very corralled nature of political dissent in Australia, the superficiality of the debate, and who can open our minds to alternative horizons. I can think of no one who can do that, as Ashish can. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Ashish.
Thank you, Philip, for those kind words, particularly because my wife is present here. It's very thoughtful of you. I'm also grateful to the Institute for Postcolonial Studies for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I have been concerned over the last few years on the nature of political participation and the kind of concerns and language that shape that participation. And this obviously has to change from country to country, culture to culture. But I do believe that certain trends are emerging globally, which we have to recognize. And I will make this point in a more roundabout way, as intellectuals are supposed to do in a formal lecture. I start by pointing out four interrelated and in fact overlapping changes which are coming into the global culture of democracy. Democracy today is triumphant as a concept. Everybody claims that he or she is a democrat if he or she is part of the ruling culture of any community, any society. I remember Ferdinand Marcos, who ran a police state in Philippines, once told a friend of mine who went as an economist to Philippines as an expert. And in a party, he buttonholed my friend and said, "You know, everybody thinks that I am a despot, but actually, I am a democrat in my heart." But these Filipinos, they are totally ungovernable and undemocratic in the spirit. So I have to guide them like a strict schoolmaster towards a more democratic Philippines. And that is held against me. Now, different versions of this justification, if you like self-justification, I have heard from many other sources. And there is no dearth of people whose instincts are not democratic but who have to rule democratic regimes all over the world, many parts of the world. I can straight away give some other examples, but let me move on. Now, as a result of this triumph of democracy, of the concept of democracy, the idea that you have to project yourself as a democrat even when you are not, which means, of course, that the older arguments against democracy ventured by many other kinds of regimes have more or less collapsed. Now we have to talk about Asian values, that also apologetically. You have to talk about the needs of development, that also a little bit apologetically, and so on and so forth. From China to Singapore to Malaysia, this is there, I'm not denying that. But on the whole, there is this triumph of the idea of democracy. But unfortunately, the idea that has triumphed is operationally exceedingly narrow. Democracy means now periodic elections, a multi-party system, a free press, and a reasonably free judiciary. And this definition has narrowed the concept of democracy globally. Even societies that have been democratic for decades, if not centuries, have revisioned, if I may use that expression, their democracies in a way that this part of democracy remains intact, so you qualify fully as democracies, but you don't care if democracy is being hollowed out by other processes. I will come to that later. First of all, and this is my second proposition, there has been, recent decades, a massive withdrawal of the citizenry from participatory democracy in democracies themselves. The citizenry now thinks it obligatory, not really obligatory, because electoral participation, voter turnout, is quite low in most of the democracies. The United States is always in 30s, for example. Last election was a little higher, but usually that is the pattern. Europe also, the participation rates are low. There is at least a felt responsibility to vote once every 4th or 5th year, and perhaps be otherwise a spectator of democratic process through the media. If you see television news every day, or read the headings on the front page of newspapers every day, you think your responsibility as a citizen, and vote every 4th or 5th year, you think your responsibilities as a democratic citizen in a democracy is more or less over. If you feel particularly perturbed over some aspects of your democracy, or for that matter some aspects of politics in some other place, then of course you are free to write angry letters to the editors, or in recent years write an angry blog in the internet. and you think your duty is certainly over. And as a result, you have a kind of politics increasingly in democratic societies, even in established democracies, which are tailor-made for this new kind of concepts of citizenship, in the sense that politics is increasingly a spectator sport. You sit on the ringside, that is, in your drawing room, seeing politics on the TV, or for that matter, even worse on the TV. They are like video games. I know one well-known hotel in Delhi put up a huge screen in its lounge for those who wanted to see the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, which George Bush's father fought, the Iraq War. So you could go there and over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, you could see the Iraq War, the bombings in night and so on and so forth. And you were advised to come late in the evening or night to see it in its full glory. So that is what is becoming to politics. And finally, democracy is increasingly becoming, for the democracies, I am not talking again, once again I want to make it clear, I am not talking of democracies which are iffy, which are run by people who have no democratic commitments, who want to run it as democracy because of various kinds of pressures on them. I'm not talking on them. Even in established democracies, there is emerging a managerial approach to politics which has come to fear the chaos and unpredictability of participatory democracy. They want democracy, but want it also to be predictable, well managed, performing, and efficient. And everybody knows that in efficiency it is very difficult to beat a despotic regime. Even in Italy, the trains, I am told, ran in time in Mussolini's time. And this efficiency, this search for efficiency, which incidentally many of the despots have now begun to give as a justification for the kind of controlled democracy they run. Lee Kuan Yew is invited every year to India as a person who has been responsible. He is no longer the head of the regime in Singapore, but he is very popular amongst India's business community. So he comes every year 3 or 4 times and gives his version of the story of what kind of success in Singapore he had produced. And invariably tells the story, whenever he gets the chance, that the clue to Singapore's success is this, that while in Singapore a conflict of interest or a problem in business is solved in one day, it takes 1 week to solve it in the nearby states and a fortnight to solve in China, and in India it takes a few months. So that's what he tells, and the businessmen love it. They think that. No. But the point I was trying to make is not of people like Lee Kuan Yew or quasi-police states like Singapore. I'm talking about established democracies. Even in established democracies now, this fear of being left behind by controlled democracies or non-democratic states in development is now so deep that gradually more and more control, more and more decisions are being taken out of the political sphere and pushed onto the laps of experts or specialists or professionals. And these experts now, one by one, these areas are ceded to them, and they now constitute a new kind of elite, an extra parliamentary power, who run affairs of the state to a great extent. Now, whatever you might say about the process of development, the decisions ultimately lie with economists and development planners. Whatever you might say about your choice in the matters of health, decisions ultimately lie with medical practitioners and their associations, and so on and so forth in every area. Even now, increasingly, external affairs, diplomacy that is, and other domains of state which were previously debated aggressively in the parliament are being handed over to experts who decide it on our behalf. I wanted to mention these 4 developments on the onset to come to the second part of my presentation, namely that in this kind of a world, the space created by the withdrawal of the citizenry from participatory politics is now being occupied, almost by default, I am tempted to say, by new kinds of formations, new kinds of political movements, and new kinds of political consciousness. Not always pleasant, not always what we might like it to be constructive, not always willing to be Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And when such opposition comes, when such groups emerge, when such forms of political consciousness occupy center stage, then we become nervous, unable to know, unable to grapple with them, because we are burdened by the categories, the ideas, concepts, formats of thought, which have proved useful in the past, but no longer that efficient in the changed circumstances where the concept of democracy has narrowed, and what seemed at one time to be reasonable or genuine range of dissent is now seen as a liability, as a danger facing a society, and so on and so forth. So this is what I am now coming to. The first and most important part of this new form of consciousness is this, that it has very little access to, and we in turn have very little access to these forms. We see them on the periphery, we see them all around us, and perhaps because we are nervous, and uncomfortable with them, we like to put them or categorize them under certain set rubrics and hope that by this method we will get a grip on them. But we rarely do, because they are by definition difficult to understand. In fact, part of their protection is this, that they are outside our range of understanding. But I will come to that part of the story a little later. Now, some of the main actors in these are not even political parties. They can often be NGOs. They can be also political movements. They can be environmental activists. They can be human rights activists, and so on and so forth. The states are never fully comfortable with them, and in many cases the states do try to set up an alternative set of activists and movements which they secretly finance or provide support in other ways, and hope thereby to neutralize the effect of the others, those who are more irresponsible, more irrational, more intractable, and to some extent constitute a threat to sanity, rationality, and pragmatic concerns. At least that's the official version. To give an example, there are two thriving Maoist movements, one in India and one in Nepal. The Maoist movement in India has affected 1/4 of all India's districts. The Maoist movement in Nepal is even more powerful. It has won a general election with the largest number of members of parliament is chosen on its ticket. Strangely enough, the world's best-known Maoist regime in China, which still swears by Mao, at least officially, whatever may be his position unofficially, in none of its news bulletins on television or in none of his newspaper ever calls Indian Maoists Maoists. They call them militants, and they never call Nepalese Maoists Maoists. Because China, in the meanwhile, has become an immensely successful and to that extent responsible regime. It doesn't want to be identified with its Maoists and doesn't want its own people to see or feel that perhaps that is another possible strain of Maoism. And to that extent, pose a threat to the regime itself. The Nepalese Maoists have tried a lot to placate China. Mr. Prachanda, who heads the party, after being elected the Prime Minister of Nepal, chose to go to China as the first foreign country he would visit. Chinese were very hospitable, but that their stance didn't change an iota. They treated Mr. Prachanda respectfully as the Prime Minister of Nepal, but did not consider giving any status as a Maoist thinker or a Maoist functionary or a leader of a Maoist party. Not even once did they mention the term Maoism when speaking of Mr. Prachanda. And the same is the case with the Indian Maoists. And if you look at it closely, in any case, this was justified. China is a respectable, I would say, developed society, world's second biggest economy. It has no reason to jeopardize its international stature by reminding its population of its past, or by hobnobbing with parties which are trying to change the status quo. China gains from the status quo. Similarly, with the Indian Maoists. There is another reason too. In both these countries, in India more than in Nepal, a majority of those who call themselves Maoists can hardly spell the word Marxism. Indian support base of the Maoists comes entirely from India's tribal population. I call them tribal because I'm told, whenever I go to Europe and North America, they tell me that I shouldn't call them tribals, I must call them indigenous people. But in India, indigeneity is more widely shared. And in any case, the tribals themselves want to call themselves tribals, so I would rather go with that. So India's tribal population, which constitute the Maoists, mainstay of the Maoists, basically know nothing of Maoism, and most of them do not know who Mao was.